All right, I'm going to give it a few minutes before I start. Give some people some time to come in here. I'll probably start right about 6:30 then, and give people time to join. You guys mind putting in chat who's here? I can't see anybody listed down at the bottom, just so I have I know who I can address. All right, so let's get started. So today we're going to learn a little bit about persistent storage, setting up our database, ORMs, object relational mapping, so that we can use them in our C#.NET application. So first thing we're going to do is set up our EF framework. That's kind of redundant, but our entity framework. So, by the way, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in chat. All right, so we want to install the entity framework first. So the first thing we need to do actually is go to our solution that we have here, right click, and go to Manage NuGet Packages. And then we want to search for the Microsoft Entity Framework SQL Server. We put that in here, go to Browse instead of Updates or Installed. They'll show up. We want to install both of these, SQL Server and SQL Server Design. I've already installed them, but there's usually a little down arrow over here. So you just click those and install those when finished installing. Then we need to edit our file to get the tools set up. So we come down here again, right? And then edit your CS project file. And add these two items here. And tell us to use the Entity Framework tools and tools.net. And then we need to go to the command for this folder and just make sure that they're installed properly. So you can right click, show folder in File Explorer, and then right here you can just click up here and type cd. That'll open the command prompt. Do it a little slower in case anybody missed. CMD just stands for command. That'll open the command prompt in the current folder that you're in. And then you need to do .NET Restore, which will install any NuGet packages you have added to your CS project that are not currently installed. I'm not going to do it right now because I've already done it. And then to make sure everything works, just type .NET Entity Framework, EF, and hit enter. And if everything works, you get prompt. So our tools are installed. This will allow us to do the migrations and everything else. So then, in order to have access to our database, we need to go down to our app settings, and we need to add this right here. Connection strings, default connection, and then this is just like in Python. You set up the path with the path to the user, or excuse me, the database that you're going to use. It's database name, trusted connection is true, active true. Most of this you're not going to mess with right now, but you're just telling it it's going to use a local DB, which is the in-memory, saved to a file, and loaded at the beginning of your application. So unlike SQL Server, which is just completely persistent and always there and accessible through anybody who wants to connect to it as long as they have permission, this one is just a file sitting somewhere, and then when you start your application, it opens that file, loads all the contents into memory, into a database structure that mimics SQL, and then you can read to and write from it, do everything that you need to, alter it, everything else, and then whenever that whenever you end the application, it just saves everything to a file again. So once we have that set up, we are good to go to start using our database. Everybody good so far? I'll take that as a yes. Can everybody hear me all right, by the way? Anybody mind putting like yes in the chat just so I can see that you guys can hear me, or is it even presenting? I didn't click present to everyone, of course. Hopefully everybody can see that. By the way, if you have any questions, beginning of your okay. Yeah, I don't know why the YouTube chat isn't showing up here in my thing here. All right, I'll just open up YouTube and mute it then. Jeez, there we go. Yes, I can zoom in on the text, Chad. All right. So that app JSON was the item group down here. We want to add the framework tools and the tools.net. And then just to go over that one thing right here, open folder in File Explorer. I don't know if you can see that very well, but it's in the context menu when you right click on your solution. And then up in the top, CMD, Charlie Mike Delta, press enter. .NET restore, and that'll bring in any NuGet packages. And then .NET EF to verify everything worked. And it might take a couple of seconds the first time you run .NET EF. So just be patient and let it run. And then you'll get this little prompt here. All right, cool. So now, excuse me. We need to set up our DB context. So I just followed along the same way so there's no confusion. The same way that they did it. Created a data folder under my main example project here. Added a new class, just called a G's DB context.cs. And it should automatically put it under the example.data namespace because you put it in the data folder. And then bring in your example.models and then extend DB context. And we need a DB set that holds our information. And we'll get to the cheese categories here in a second. But for now, we just need to have a DB set. This holds our cheese from our cheese database, or our cheese table in our database. And then we're going to need this here in just a second. We go to our startup CS file. And in our configure services, we need to set up the DB context. So we just do services.add DB context of type cheese DB context. And you're going to have to bring in the example.data up here so you have access to cheese DB context. And then we're going to pass in a Lambda function that takes options as an argument and then sets the options use SQL Server configuration get configuration string default connection. And that is the one that we set in the app JSON settings, this connection strings default connection. And then, of course, leave the services.add MVC, so we have all those as well. So then that tells the program to use this database for this context, or for this object in the DB context. So then we need to go to our your main controller. Mine's called example controller. And we're going to pull in that information. So before we had something like cheese data dot all, which then pulled a list from the static variable that was stored in cheese data. But now we're going to use our context. So we need to define our private variable. Doesn't need to be used outside of this, so there's no need to have it as a public. So we have a private variable, cheese context, or cheese DB context. It's called a context. And then at the very beginning, we have another constructor that we add that accepts a context, a database context object. And we just set that equal to our local context. So when this gets instantiated, it gets past the context that we defined before, and then we just simply use that internally. So in the index, we're going to return a view, and in the view, we're going to pass all of the cheeses. So initially, before we set up category, it'll just be to list. So it'll grab all the cheeses, convert it to a list, and pass that. And then if you look at our index HTML, cheese.description, you'll probably have cheese.type, cheese.name. It still stays the same because we're still just using cheese as our model. And then here, since we're converting this to a list, everything stays the same. We're just passing in a list of cheese objects. In the add handler, we need to do the same thing, except we're now going to use our cheese view model and pass it in. Well, you could leave that blank for now, but it'll probably look like that for right now until we add the categories. I'll come back and go through this with the categories here in a second. This stays the same. We're still using the add cheese view model. This is pretty much going to stay the same. But when you set it, you now need to actually add it to the cheeses in the context. If we look at our DB context, it's the cheeses, our DB set. So we need to, I just want to undo that. Okay, just make sure I'm back to the normal state. So we need to use our, instead of just instantiating a cheese and adding it to the list in cheese data, we now need to add it to our context. So we have context.cheeses, which is a DB set. We just add a new cheese, do the same thing we did. Again, I'll get to this in a second. And then after we add our new cheese, we need to do a context.saveChanges. If you don't do that, it won't write it to the database. And then just like before, we return example. This is the same thing. If it's invalid, then it'll just return here with any errors in there. We're still using the same cheese view or add cheese view model, so everything stays the same there. If we want to remove, we just do the same thing we did in the index, get the context cheeses, convert it to a list. With this one, we don't care about categories because we're not doing anything with categories in the remove. So we're just converting it to a list, return the view. I'm using ViewBag still here. I haven't converted that over to a view model. And then when remove, I'm just iterating through each cheese ID. And then now we're going to use the context again, because context is where all of our cheese information is stored. All of our data, it's all in there. So context.cheeses, remove, and then I'm using the context.cheeses.single to get a single result out of that set and passing it a lambda function that compares, X is going to be a cheese, compares the cheese ID to ID here. That's in this one right here as it iterates. And then so it'll remove each one by one, and then we'll do a context.saveChanges, and that'll remove them. Oh, I forgot to add one thing here in models. The cheese, we need to remove a few things. We need to remove the type. We don't need the enumerator anymore because that'll be converted over to a cheese category. and we need to set a public int capital ID. As they stated, if you watch the prep work, it can also be cheese ID. Either one is fine. It'll automatically map to that in the database. And we'll get to this in a second. So then once you've done all that, ignoring categories, you can go to, oops, wrong thing. Go to your example and open up a PowerShell. You can run .NET .NET. Hang on, I always forget this command. I can't remember the order that it goes in. So it is migrations add. So migrations add, and then name your migration. Whatever you want it to be. And then that will automatically scour your project, find any DB context, and add them to your migrations. And then you can add, excuse me. And then as we add things, we add more migrations. So you can do your initial migration and then do your, after everything's set up, like we just did, making sure that everything's tied together, you can go to build solution, make sure there are no errors. I'm building everything right now, but cool. And then you can run .NET EF update database, and that'll run the migration. So then once you, well, I'll go over the cheese controller or the cheese category. So the other thing we need to do is add our cheese category now. And this is going to be another thing that's stored in the database, and we'll reference it in our cheese object. So we have our cheese category. It's going to have an ID. It's going to have a name. And then a list of cheeses. This will be the reference back to all cheeses that have this particular category assigned to it. We're just using an iList because we don't need it to be any more specific than that. So it can basically be used anywhere an iList can be used. So it's much more generic than a list. So we're using iList of type cheese. I'm just going to call it cheeses. And then back in our cheese DB context, I'm going to add another set, cheese categories. And then in our cheese, we need to add a category ID. And that, again, will map to cheese category. And then our cheese category. So this one maps to the category. This one actually displays category information, contains the actual cheese category object. So then back in our sample controller, now in our index, we want to include the category. Anybody have any questions so far? Cool. So we want to get our cheeses, but this time we want to insert include. Again, a Lambda function. Passing in the cheese object, we want to include cheese.category, and then toList. And now we're passing that to our view so that the cheese will have the category preloaded from the database based on the cheese ID. Now when we add, going to add cheese view model, context categories, toList, and in our cheese view model, where am I? View models. Add cheese view model. We now have a category ID, a list of cheese categories. This is going to take place of that other list, the select list items. This is going to be the this is actually what's going to be cast from the actual form. Since it's an integer, we need to store that because the form's not going to pass an actual object, a cheese category object. It can only pass the ID of it, so we need to have a category ID. And then we need to add this constructor here so that we can populate this list. Before we were just doing that manually, so we didn't need to actually pass anything into it, but now we need a constructor to accept the cheese categories, which comes from here that we're pulling from the database. And then we're going to do the same thing we did before, except it's actually easier for loop than the enum. So we instantiate a new empty list, loop through each category and categories, which is passed here. And then we're going to go and add cheese categories, our select list item, a new select list item with the value being the ID to string, and text cat.name. Cool. This is important. The other thing that you're going to need to have is this. Since you're overriding the default constructor with this, you're also going to have to just define an empty constructor that accepts no parameters, because when you submit the form, when it comes back to the controller, it's going to try and instantiate and add cheese view model with no parameters and then set what was in the form, which is the name, description, and category ID. So then in our view for add, we need to switch this over from type to category ID. This is going to be for category ID using model.cheese_categories. Still using the same add cheese view model. This is now using cheese categories, category ID, and category ID. Everybody good so far? Cool. So then now when we submit that, it's going to come back here. It's going to instantiate a cheese view model. If it's good, everything is passing the validation. Then we're going to, again, do what we did before, except for we're going to set the category of the cheese equal to context.categories. We're going to get a single, and we're going to match that to the ID that was passed in the cheese view model. So ID, this is going to be, or X is going to be each category in the categories list. It's going to compare the ID to the ID that was passed into category ID or assigned to category ID when you submitted that form. And when it finds it, it'll return that single value and assign that to the category field or property in your cheese object. And again, save changes. So remove stays the same. Yeah. And then now that we have that, we can actually add a category here if we wanted to list all categories. That accepts an integer, which is the ID of the category we're looking for. If it's 0, which is an invalid category, we just return it back to the main slash category, which I don't have set up just for time's sake. But if it is anything other than 0, we do category, we get a single category, but we want to, this time, include all cheeses that exist in that category. So we do an include, passes the category, and we want to include category.cheeses, just like we did up here with the cheese.category. We're doing the opposite here and grabbing all all cheeses that exist in that category. And then we're going to grab the single item where category ID equals ID. So we're loading all the cheeses for all the categories and then grabbing the one that we want. I have this set up just like they did in the prep work category name. And then we return the view, and we're going to use index. It's just like here, index accepted a list of cheeses. We can do the exact same thing, use the exact same view. We're going to tell it we're going to use index view and just pass it the cheeses that exist in that category. So then now that you've added the other, oh yeah, I don't think I went over this here. You need to set this up. DB context, you need to tell this to accept options. Which is the DB context options for cheese DB context. And then you want to call the base options so that it calls the base constructor. Sorry, I forgot to go over that earlier. We go to, yeah, okay, we did that. All right, so this is required as well. And then since you've done that, you need to actually go back. Now that you've added another object to your DB context, back to PowerShell, .NET EF migrations, add, and then add cheese category or whatever you want to call it. And then that'll build that out based on the new things that you've added, which in this case would be the cheese ID or the category ID that you added to the cheese object, and then of course the category cheese category object itself. So it'll create a table for that as well, and then do the .NET database update. Good. So then that will allow you good project, or excuse me, view, SQL Server Object Explorer. And then you'll have SQL Server here. You can see local DB, databases, cheese MVC. And then you can look at your tables, get categories, cheeses, right click, view data. You can see that I've got a bunch of cheeses in here already, category IDs that exist. So this is the foreign key category ID, which references of course it's not open, which references the ID in here, and we'll pull this information in. So these are all the categories that I added. So in here, by the way, you can actually just add another one. You can just edit it. You can edit the table in here if you want to. You can also delete, actually. So you can modify your data that way if you want to, if you wanted to set up some pre-data. You can also, if you just simply double click on it or right click and view designer, you can see, excuse me, you can see the actual table structure. It's the keys, primary key, its ID. You can see here, this is a variable character for the name. This one is nullable. You can set that so it's not if you wanted to. If we go into cheeses, you can see here that there are foreign keys, and this foreign key is that category ID, which in parentheses here says ID, so it references the ID in the category. And then, in the category. In the keys, you can see our primary key again here is ID. So this is our primary key. It's got a little key next to it. Category ID is a foreign key, which references the ID field in the category table. So now if we run this, it pulls everything I already had in the database. We added cheese. Choose our category, like add. It's now in there. If we remove cheese, we're now gone. And if we close this, stop the server, restart the server again, it's persistent. It's all right there. So one of the cool things that you can do actually here is, this is the script file. If you, oops, that's not what I want. View, database, data. You can see here, here's the actual script that it runs at the beginning. So it inserts those values into the database when you start this. Insert into database 0 or DBO, cheeses, the ID, description, name, and category with the values 3, NS or SDF, SDF, ASDF, ASDF, and then category being 1. And you can edit this and run it as well to insert other things. So this is all the stuff that gets set when it starts. So if you do the same thing with that's actually creating the table. And if we look at the script, you can see here all of the insert commands for all of the values or categories. And that's about it, really. Anybody have any questions? Okay. All right, well, that's all I got. So nobody has any questions? Good to go.